Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us for this event to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In preparation for this event, I thought back to 2015, 5 years ago, when the nation celebrated the 25th anniversary of the ADA. At that time, I had the privilege of working in the federal government at the US Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. I remember at that time, literally 5 years ago, probably to the day, attending a very similar event, of course in person at the time, pre-pandemic, where we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the ADA. We were privileged to hear from Bob Dole, who was one of the legislative sponsors and supporters of the ADA. And I was struck by two observations during that time period. The first was just simply how transformational the ADA has been in our society, that landmark piece of civil rights legislation has opened doors of opportunities for countless Americans and making sure that people have full access, whether in employment, in places of public accommodation, in housing, regardless of their disability. But the other thing that struck me about that anniversary was simply how much more work still needs to be done. At the Department of Justice, the disability rights section of the Civil Rights Division was probably our largest section at the time. And every day I remember just reading about all of the really important cases and matters that they were handling all across the country, where people with disabilities were facing horrific discrimination and horrific challenges in ways that for me were simply unimaginable. And it was in many ways shocking for me, having spent many years as a civil rights lawyer, that those challenges, that discrimination was largely invisible to me and is invisible to so many Americans. In fact, just this past weekend, two leaders in the disability rights community published a really powerful op-ed in the New York Times, where they made a very similar point that they estimated approximately 20 million Americans have some form of a disability, and yet many Americans and many people in this country simply are blind, either by choice or by lack of knowledge, to the challenges that those individuals continue to face each and every day, and the ways in which we have systems of injustice and inequity that prevent meaningful access and meaningful participation for far too many Americans, even today, even as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of this landmark legislation. And so I'm really excited for this panel, both to celebrate what progress has been made, and indeed there has been tremendous progress, but also hopefully to challenge us to do better, to be more inclusive, and to make sure that the words of the statute are not just words on a piece of paper or words in a book of law, but real access and real promise of equality and equal treatment for all people. The other thing I'm really excited that I know this panel will talk about is the role of the New York State human rights law in this conversation. Here at the Division of Human Rights, we have the great privilege and responsibility of enforcing the New York State human rights law. And there are many noteworthy things to be said about our state anti-discrimination law. In fact, it was the first state-level anti-discrimination law across the country. And this year, we're actually celebrating the 75th anniversary of that landmark. But also, another thing that's really exciting and relevant to this conversation is that 16 years before the ADA was passed, back in 1974, in New York State, we actually included many of the protections in the ADA in our state level law. And I'm proud to say that in that act, New York State led the nation in making sure that protections and accommodations for people with disabilities were important as a matter of public policy and anti-discrimination provision and protection. And I know the panelists today will talk about not just the ADA, but also the role that the New York State human rights law plays in this broader conversation. And finally, no discussion today is possible without thinking and talking about the impact of COVID-19 and the current pandemic and the ways in which that has completely changed and morphed every aspect of our daily life, the way we think about how we live, how we work, how we deal with other people. And we also know, unfortunately, that the pandemic has brought new challenges and new complications for people with disabilities in thinking about issues of what does it mean to have meaningful, reasonable accommodation, and what does it mean to have full and meaningful access and participation and opportunity in all the aspects of civil life without jeopardizing and risking the health and safety of our fellow citizens and colleagues and New Yorkers. And so I'm excited that this panel today will tackle all of these thorny but really important issues. And in order to do that, I'm thrilled that we have assembled a real panel of experts. I know that their bios have been shared in the chat, so I won't go through it, but I just want to thank James, Megan, Catherine, and Susan for joining us this morning, for sharing your time, your expertise, your wisdom with us. I know I'm looking forward to a really exciting, challenging, and important conversation. And with that, I would turn it over to my colleague, my esteemed colleague, John Herian, who is the Director of Disability Rights here at the New York State Division of Human Rights. John.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Smith, for those remarks. Before we get into the Q&A session with our presenters, I wanted to touch on a few items relevant to the New York State Division of Human Rights processing of complaints, especially during this time of the pandemic. So first and foremost, the New York State Division of Human Rights is open for business. And to ensure that the rights of all New Yorkers continue to be protected throughout the pandemic, we've made a number of changes to our complaint process to facilitate access while safeguarding public health. DHR, the Division of Human Rights, continues to accept and process complaints and issue decisions during the COVID-19 pandemic. New complaints can be filed via email, mail, or fax without notarization of the complaint, which was a previous requirement that we now waive in order to facilitate easier access to our agency. Please note that all complaints do need to be signed before submission. DHR staff will take new complaints over the phone for any individuals who require an accommodation for a disability or have no access to a computer. Secondly, I want to touch on a new initiative that has been rolled out that speaks to an accelerated process to effectively and efficiently investigate and prosecute claims of discrimination related to COVID-19. Division of Human Rights has implemented an expedited process for the investigation and resolution of complaints related to COVID-19. Many of these complaints involve potential issues of disability discrimination, such as allegations that employers terminated or denied leave for workers who were diagnosed with COVID-19, and that workers with underlying health conditions were not provided with adequate reasonable accommodations. We've trained our staff across the state on how to address issues of reasonable accommodation related to COVID-19, and within 5 business days of the case being assigned, our investigative offices will start sharing the process of gathering evidence and attempting conciliation between the parties. The New York State Division of Human Rights has been successful in facilitating expedited conciliations in some of these cases since the program has been commenced. Cases are scheduled for a virtual conciliation conference, usually within 2 weeks of the case being assigned. The conference assists with bringing the parties together at the outset to discuss potential settlement and also gather information via interviews. Our central headquarters review the determinations that our investigating offices make to ensure consistency with the law. If our investigating office determines that there is reason to believe that the law may have been violated or there have been issues that need to go before an administrative law judge to get resolved, the complaint will move forward to a hearing. And within 30 days of such a decision, a pre-hearing settlement conference will be scheduled before an administrative law judge. If the complaint does not settle at this juncture, the case will go before an administrative law judge for a public hearing, which works essentially like a trial within 60 days. A division attorney will be assigned to prosecute the discrimination complaint, and within 60 days of the hearing's conclusion, the judge will issue a recommended order on whether discrimination has occurred. So I share all this information with you to identify the fact that the New York State Division of Human Rights is taking these complaints very seriously, and we're looking to process and prosecute these complaints in a way that's uniform and effective and efficient. Now I'd like to turn it over to introducing our presenters and move into a Q&A program with them. I want to start by introducing Jim Weissman. I had the privilege and honor and joy of working with Jim for 12 years prior to my taking the job here at the New York State Division of Human Rights. Jim is the president and CEO of United Spinal Association. He joined United Spinal, then called Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, as an attorney in 1979. 11 years before the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Jim sued New York City's transit system and won bus access, key subway and rail station access, and the creation of a paratransit system to supplement mass transit for those with disabilities, to prevent them from to allow them to use bus and rail systems. Jim was a key negotiator with members of Congress promoting the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And presently, United Spinal Association, led by Jim Weissman, is active in the disability rights movement and was successful in getting New York City's yellow cabs to be 50% accessible by 2020. Next, I'd like to introduce Susan Dua. Susan is the executive director of the Center for Independence of the Disabled New York. And we've always enjoyed a great relationship with Susan and with her agency. And I've always very much enjoyed and valued the opportunity where she's welcomed us into her office to meet with her staff, to do presentations on the New York State human rights law, and have discussions about what needs were not being met, where we could be more effective, and how the process works for enforcing the state human rights law for people with disabilities. Susan chairs the Association of Independent Living Centers in New York State and is herself a person living with a disability. Catherine Carroll, I've gotten to know Catherine and work with her over the past couple of years with a group that's focused on access issues for people with disabilities to health care. Catherine Carroll is an assistant commissioner in the Law Enforcement Bureau of the New York City Commission on Human Rights, where she oversees the Bureau's investigation and prosecution of publicly initiated cases in housing and public accommodations. Catherine has been with the Commission since 2012, and she is the incoming chair of the Disability Law Committee for the New York City Bar Association. Lastly, Megan Parker. I've known Megan for a number of years, going back to her work with the Westchester Disabled on the Move. Megan is presently the Director of Advocacy for the New York Association on Independent Living. The division has also enjoyed a great relationship with independent living centers around the state of New York in terms of trying to advance civil rights for people with disabilities. So we always enjoy our opportunities to be with independent living centers around New York State. In her role as Director of Advocacy, Megan coordinates the statewide Systems Advocacy Network, which advocates for the full inclusion and civil rights of people with disabilities in New York State. Megan has spent her adult life advocating for civil rights for people with disabilities. So we welcome all of our presenters here this morning and thank them for their time. We're going to begin now with our question and answer session. I'd like to start with a question for Jim Weissman. Jim, you've been here for anniversaries 1 through 30 for the Americans with Disabilities Act and for before. And you're also a noted framer and architect of select provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. What I wanted to ask you, Jim, to start the program is what led you to that time and place where you were in position to do such great work?
Well, I could start that I was a counselor in a camp for disabled kids when I was 16, and I met contemporaries with disabilities. And I was a counselor there with having no idea what I was going to do. I just was a kid looking for a job, but couldn't drive and was using a bicycle to get to work. I had to get to work somewhere I could bike, and that's where I went. And it opened up a whole new world to me. And my friends, my contemporaries with disabilities became my friends. And I ended up going to law school, but I stayed friendly with these people through high school and college. And one of them was Paul Hearn. Paul was the founder of AAPD, and they give that Paul Hearn Award to emerging leaders every year. But we were both contemporaries. He went to Hofstra, so when I would come home from college, I'd go visit him all the time. And you'd go to a bar and they'd say, don't put him there, or a restaurant, and I'd say, he speaks, talk to him. I never thought there ought to be a law until I think people were foolish, but I didn't think there ought to be a law until I went to law school. And you start thinking about how the law can be used to change things. But the way I got involved in ADA is because we had quite a bit of advocacy pre-ADA in New York City. And a lot of it was transportation related. And the community kind of organized and galvanized around transportation so that even people who could use transit with disabilities would participate in the effort to fight the transit officials, because they saw it as a statement about the ultimate worth of being accommodated and of having disabled people integrated into the society. So we had already beaten New York City and Philadelphia, which were the two oldest, largest rail cities in New York, in the country, prior to ADA, and there were absolutely no transportation consultants willing to assist, and I mean zero, willing to assist the disability community in lobbying against the mass transit operators. So I spent the next 2 years doing, the 88 to 90, doing the transit piece, but that bled into judiciary. Every committee of Congress can amend any part of the bill, so that it doesn't have to be the transportation committee like in New York State that's dealing with transit issues. It could be something else. And so we ended up before quite a few committees testifying and debunking all the myths about disabled people that we had debunked on the New York City and Philadelphia level. And that I thought, when you grow up with the Crip Camp generation, and that's the way I feel now. I didn't know that until I saw the movie recently, but those are the disabled people I knew. I didn't think that disabled people were homebound and shut-ins and shy and unemployed. I thought of them as aggressive and dynamic, and was surprised when I realized that I was dealing with this very small tip of the disability iceberg that's the disability community. So I got involved with disabled people as a young person that were active and wanted to change the world. And so it was easy for me to get caught up in it. And luckily, Congress didn't know what to do with transportation and the ADA, because some cities were paratransit only and wanted to stay that way, even though their paratransit was bad. They were getting away with it under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, providing bad paratransit. And even though some cities were lifts on buses only, and there was very few buses that were putting lifts on at that point, it was just beginning in most cities. And they realized it was cheap to do that compared to paratransit, and the list didn't work, and they didn't market them to people with disabilities who hadn't used mass transit. But they were getting away with it under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act with having bad service. And some cities did an amalgam of both kinds of services, but nobody was doing a great job. But everybody thought that if they were required to do this under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and there was the provisions essentially were being grandfathered into the ADA, that they wouldn't have to do any more. So transit was not really, while they opposed lifts on buses as an organized transit lobby, they were not adamant, because they felt like they'd continue to get away with murder up until then. So we took advantage of their lack of cohesiveness. And if you look at the statute, there's quite a bit of transportation information in the language of the law. It's the biggest piece of the act, I think. And it's because there were so many horrific violations of rights and in the transportation area that we tried to outlaw them one by one. It's worked, relatively well. I guess we'll talk about that later. It's worked relatively well, but there's lots of things we could have done differently. I mean, when you have people that aren't transportation experts dictating transportation standards to transportation experts, it's a mess. And that's what seems to always happen with disability rights. We have to propose the solution as well as articulate the need. If we don't have a good solution, we lose. The experts never solve our problem. We have to come to the table with it.
You mentioned debunking myths. What were some of those myths that you had to debunk?
Well, the chairman of the Cleveland Transit Authority, prior to ADA, went to an environmental impact scoping statement meeting and testified that the U.S. Department of Transportation has to think about the impact on public transportation of disabled people getting sick on public transportation. I testified next. I said, I have prepared remarks, but I have to respond. I'm in New York City. I take public transit every day. The impact of people getting sick on public transit is, I'll save you millions in consulting fees. The impact is you move a few feet away from the sick person, as far away as you can get. That's the impact. I mean, what are we talking about? Disabled people aren't different. They're the same people as the people who are already on transit. We had Congressman Dingell from Michigan, who passed away last year, try to amend the ADA to take out mental health coverages, both intellectual disability and emotional disabilities were not going to be covered because he had watched a show on Tourette's syndrome on LA Law, and there was a lawyer who cursed, outbursts with obscenity, and he didn't want any of those people on Amtrak, which is covered by the Act, and he chaired the committee that funded Amtrak. He didn't want them on Amtrak because his grandchildren took the train to Washington, D.C. So we explained that people with Tourette's are already on the train. They don't need ramps and elevators. It must not be a problem. He was adamant. We got mental health advocates in Michigan to write and call, which he was furious about, that we had kind of outed him to the mental health community. And then we got the president of Amtrak to discuss this with Dingell, who told him, we don't need that kind of protection. We do not put people off the train or refuse to sell tickets because of disabilities. We do it because you're dangerous and disruptive. That's it. If we do anything else, we should be sued. If we put you off the train because you're Black or Italian, we should get sued. And if we put you off the train because you're disabled, we should too. Thank you, but we don't need the protection. But it was those kind of things. Everybody thinks, the congressman, a Democrat, who chaired transportation, Bud Schuster from Altoona, Pennsylvania, was saying things like, my mother, he actually said my mother is a wheelchair. He meant my mother uses a wheelchair. But his quote was, my mother is a wheelchair and I oppose accessible transportation. He didn't mean to say is, but he was wholly showing you his knuckles. You see my knuckles? I banged them on doors, pushing her wheelchair through. Of course, they weren't accessible doorways that he was pushing it through. So he wanted to tell us that he's empathetic. He understands people with disabilities because he has this elderly mother who we would never put on the bus. It took me back to when Carol Bellamy was city council president in New York, famous liberal champion of civil rights, well, women's rights. She was on the MTA board. And she said, won't disabled people, at a public hearing, she asked me, this has got to be 10, 12 years before ADA, won't disabled people be victims of crime on public transportation? And I said, yes. And that's all I said. And she said, and yet you'd put them on the subway. And I said, no, I wouldn't. And she said, I thought that's what this is all about. And I said, no, it's about that they'll choose to take it. Not that I would put them anywhere. Right. They'll choose to take transportation because they're living in substandard housing in substandard neighborhoods. And in America, the only way out is work, access to the labor force. And the chairman of the transit authority looked at her like, is that stop now, please? But she kept it up. And someone, I think it was Pat Figueroa, yelled, we were in the World Trade Center in a hearing, and Pat Figueroa yelled out from the back of the room, oh, she said, you're not a member of the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, are you? And I said, well, no, I work for them. And someone in the back of the room, Pat yelled out, what's the matter, we can't hire lawyers? And she went on to say, sir, I can't hear you. If you would stand up, I mean, it's just begging to be embarrassed. Sir, if you would stand up, I could hear you. And he yelled back, if I could stand up, I wouldn't have to be here. And the room was, going wild, applauding him and things. But then when we did the ADA, those exact same discussions happened again and again and again. And Jesse Helms, if you look at his amendment to the ADA, it's all about transvestitism and homosexuals and people with gender identity disorders, and they're not covered by the ADA. Homosexuals didn't want to be, they didn't consider themselves to be disabled. So it wasn't really controversial in that community. But the Senate and the House passed that amendment so that kleptomania, which is a psychological term he was familiar with, and there's no other reason in the world why it would be an exemption from the ADA because of the job relatedness qualifier for reasonable, when you have to hire people for reasonable accommodation. If you're working in Tiffany's, kleptomania is a huge problem. If you're working in a garbage dump, it's not. And there's probably a job for everyone if you look at it that way. But people with kleptomania are not covered by the ADA. And that's the kind of ignorance that I'm talking about, that is how they were looking at people with disabilities.
And it seems you were successful in large part, obviously, in debunking those myths and getting the ADA passed. In terms of celebrating, the ADA today and during this time, what do you point to as some of the realizations that were made for people with disabilities through the passage of the ADA?
Well, to me, the benefit of the ADA is the heightened expectations. It's an intangible. It's not all new buses are going to be accessible or something like that, which is you could put your arms around. But I think that up until ADA, the people who without disabilities didn't even consider the potential of people with disabilities living lives of accomplishment and satisfaction. And I think that they just assumed that you'd be out of the labor force or underemployed or part-time or living with a relative and the ADA not only raised the expectation level of people with disabilities about living satisfying lives, but I think it changed people's perception. Now it's slow and it's fits and starts and there's big exceptions to this, but I think that we've created a collective consciousness about needs and rights that didn't exist pre-ADA, even though the needs existed and even a lot of the rights existed. When we used the human rights law in 1979 or 80 to sue Levittown, I believe, Parks Department, for refusing admission to a wheelchair user because she was a wheelchair user. Black letter law. You're not getting in except between the hours of 12 and 2 on weekday afternoons. And that's only if you pass a special test administered just for you by the lifeguard. Black letter law, New York State law, 1974, you can't refuse admission to a place of public accommodation on the basis of disability. And non-swimmers obviously are allowed right in. It's only if you show up in a wheelchair that or with an obvious physical disability that you're detained and prevented from entering. So to me, this should be won on summary judgment. It wasn't. And the Levittown Parks Department commissioner said people with disabilities would be dangerous to themselves and dangerous to everyone else in a pool. And the judge agreed with them. And it took, I left and went to the governor's office and then EPBA, but my successor, it took 2 years to undo that damage. And it's because judges are people too, and they have these biases. Maybe I'm not getting in the pool with her, or maybe he just thinks she was a silver medalist in a Paralympic swimming, by the way, and probably swam better than everyone who used the pool. So she was the ideal plaintiff too. Right. But the law says one thing, but people are people. And it takes a while for this to evolve. I think the biggest undone thing, well, for me personally, it's subway stations, but I'll talk about that. But I think is employment. People are just not employed in great numbers with disabilities, and the Emancipation Proclamation that might have been the ADA was undermined by the benefit system when it came to employment until Obamacare, where you can actually switch from benefits to an employer's health plan without a pre-existing condition exclusion or waiting period. But it's kind of too little too late. There's been this whole 30 years of 65% unemployment among severely disabled people. And that was not what we envisioned at all. We figured employment was the key to changing this socioeconomic status, that your social status rises as you're employed. If your boss is disabled, you don't feel sorry for him. Is the, kind of a thumbnail, kind of a sketch of how that works. And it didn't happen in great numbers. I mean, there's extreme, notable exceptions, but the numbers aren't there.
Right. Susan, I'd like to move on to a question or two for you. Thank you, Jim, very much. Susan, you've been a longtime advocate for people with disabilities. What do you recall about the time when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed? You're on mute, Susan. There you go. Now you're good.
What I remember is watching through the media the successful coalition building, the extraordinary bringing together of groups that didn't necessarily have a history of working together. Each movement had its own specific history of achieving change, and they came together through work with lawmakers. There was disability-led grassroots advocacy that impressed me tremendously. There were demonstrations. People were making what Congressman John Lewis called good trouble. And I was excited to see that. I had grown up as a daughter of parents who were involved in the civil rights movement. My father going back to the days of Emmett Till. And I remember going to demonstrations and meetings and looking at how civil rights campaigns came together. Even as a child, this interested me. I remember that I was working on discrimination in health coverage. In New York State, we allowed insurance companies selling policies to individuals and to small groups to discriminate, to charge people more money, to prohibit enrollment, to impose pre-existing condition exclusions without limit. And we got together a number of disability organizations. One in particular I remember most vividly is the MS Society. And we were working together successfully to change the law, to outlaw that kind of discrimination for individuals and small businesses. That wasn't outlawed more broadly until the Affordable Care Act. And I like to think or pretend that what we did in New York was a model for that. Who knows, maybe it was. I remember particularly having a dog in the fight. As I had a disability, my parents had disabilities. I married a man who had disabilities. And discrimination was part of our everyday lives, but it was portrayed as normality. It was so integrated into how people thought about themselves. People with no disability understood their experiences to be normal. And then anyone else was not normal and somehow shameful or invisible. And those were very, very important lessons to learn very early on. I remember in the early years after the ADA, the celebrations in New York City. And at that time, celebrations of disability pride were called the Disability Independence Day March. And we focused on issues. We focused on what barriers needed still to be removed. We didn't come just to show that we were together as a community, that we were proud of our accomplishments, we came together to say, hey, this far and no further. And we're going to push ahead to achieve greater change. At the time, we were talking about health reform. And I had begun working with Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was one of the first AIDS service organization, a disability-led organization staffed by people with disabilities, serving people with disabilities. And I began working for them on health reform. And I remember just the incredible fervor at that time. I helped to write a position paper for NCLE, the National Council on Independent Living. And I remember all of the arguments among the contributors about what should the leading disability rights organization in the nation say about people with disabilities, the leading disability-led organization. And it was just such a very powerful moment of trying to get protections and inserted for people with disabilities and services inserted. And it was really a very creative time, I think, because very early on there began to be challenges. And everyone was watching what were the government agencies going to do? What was the Department of Justice going to do? 1990 was the year I got my law degree. And so it was fascinating to watch the first days of a civil rights law unfold before my eyes. Very, very powerful time. And we'll talk later perhaps about some of the gains and the disappointments and the challenges I had.
Yeah, I think Jim touched on some of the gains, and I think at this point, it would be nice to hear, in terms of celebrating the passage of the ADA, what are some of the accomplishments you think have been realized for people with disabilities?
I think that it's important to say that everything that we gained and worked on is always a work in progress. Change is a constant. Change will never end. We are in a civil rights march that has no end point. We will have to keep going. And so we gained polling site accessibility as a result of a legal battle. My organization, Sydney, had been doing polling site surveys for more than a decade, showing that polling sites were not accessible for people with disabilities in many, many ways. And we gave these surveys and spoke to the City Board of Elections and the State Board of Elections, and year after year, no movement, no movement. Finally, a plaintiff, led by Jim Weissman, led a lawsuit which used, and the judge cited and displayed, the entire record of polling sites surveys that Sydney had done. It was such a proud moment for our grassroots community surveyors who came together, learned about what the Department of Justice standards were, and went out and gathered evidence and told their own stories. You know, incredibly proud moment. But we still have a long way to go. We go out still on every election day and survey the polling sites, and we still have quite a distance to go. The same is true with online ballots. We've been a part of a lawsuit for people who are blind and people with limited dexterity about online ballots and can you use them? And the ballots on the State Board of Elections website were not accessible, not usable. And so we got some partial victories then, but that battle is ongoing because there are still barriers there. One of our early victories was quite relevant in these days of COVID, so I have to tell you about it. It had to do with emergency preparedness.
Oh, yeah.
At the beginning of what was to be Hurricane Irene and later became Tropical Storm Irene, I was desperately worried about what was going to happen to people with disabilities who could be trapped by the storm without services, who could be denied shelter or the accommodations they needed to benefit, to have equal access, full and equal access. And so I went out and I went from shelter to shelter to see if anyone could get in. And then we got a phone call from a young woman, a young Latina in Queens, who had tried to go to a shelter and had literally been locked out. There was no way for her to signal people inside. Somebody saw her and went in and alerted them. And they came out and said, yeah, well, you know, there's a gate to the back door, but nobody has a key. So you just have to go home and ride out the storm. And then I remember more and more people coming forward with their tales of being trapped in high rises, not being able to get transportation, going as they were told to take a bus, but the buses were full and no one would let them on. And so they had to wheel, literally, back home to wait it out. There's so many stories, and it's so relevant today because the point of the case is that disasters are inclusive of people with disabilities, as a very famous disability advocate once said, but disaster planning and response are not unless you require it. I'm paraphrasing her badly, but, and that applies to COVID-19. That applies to pandemics. It applies to any other disaster that comes along the way. And it's especially relevant now as we deal with complaints about discrimination, as we see testing and tracing rolling out in New York City, for example, with no plan whatsoever for people who can't leave their homes. Right. For example. and so that we have a long way to go. But it was a powerful beginning on that issue that still resonates today for me. Curb cut.
Thanks very much, Susan.
Yeah, thank you.
I know.
So many others.
Catherine Carroll, I was hoping you could speak to some of the work the City Human Rights Commission is doing around civil rights for people with disabilities, especially during this time of COVID-19.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and Jim and Susan. It's great to hear your perspective on the whole history of the ADA. As someone who came to this work a little bit later, you know, at the commission, we, echoing what Commissioner Smith was saying about the DOJ, disability claims are by far the highest number of complaints that we file on an annual basis, and it's something that, you know, shocked me when I came to the agency, and something that continues to shock me today because it's been 30 years, and, you know, the discrimination we see in this area continues to be, I think, some of the most explicit we see across the protected classes that are covered under the city human rights law. So I guess for people who don't know, or maybe joining from upstate, the City Commission on Human Rights is the New York City counterpart to the State Division on Human Rights, and we enforce the city's civil rights statute that includes many similar protections, especially in the area for people with disabilities. I think, you know, we continue to confront very explicit discrimination, and we're, you know, counsel for landlords or counsel for providers of public accommodation continue to say things that you couldn't imagine them saying in the context of another protected class. And it continues to astonish me, which I think is what took my turn towards working in disability work, is that it's just, you can't believe the things that come out of someone's mouth. And I think that speaks to some of the work that continues to need to happen in the education front, and just making it socially unacceptable to say some of those things seems like the first step. I think the step that has been made is that attorneys who say things like that now get admonished by judges when they do, but, you know, that's just one small step. So I think the commission continues to see the you know, regular type of disability discrimination cases, failure to have a ramp, things like that. But COVID has presented a really interesting conundrum for us, as it has for everyone. I think partially because New York City continues to be in a serious lockdown, and the presumption that people are working from home. The bulk of cases we've seen so far have been in the housing and public accommodation sphere. We're planning and preparing for what the employment cases will look like, but other than essential workers and some service workers who are now going back to work in restaurants and things, most people are still working from home where possible. And that, luckily, we haven't gotten a lot of claims related to failure to accommodate because of a desire to work from home, because the work from home order coming from the mayor's office still continues to be relatively broad. But we are seeing shocking, I guess I shouldn't say shocking, but they continue to shock me, instances of discrimination in places of public accommodation with regard to people wanting to go grocery shopping, for example, with an aide who they may require in order to be able to go in the store, and being told, no, only one person can come in at a time. You're not allowed to, one person per household can come in. And a lot of just ongoing lack of education around some of these issues. And, I think Susan hit the nail on the head. There's a one size fits all disaster policy in place. And as we all know, one size fits all doesn't work with the ADA. It doesn't work with a reasonable accommodation framework. And, just we have to keep having that conversation over and over again. The housing context has been very interesting to me, the novel ways in which landlords are trying to gain what I think most of us would consider confidential health information about their tenants in an attempt to create public safety guidelines for all of their tenants is, I think, in some instances, blatant discrimination, and I think in other instances really creates an interesting legal question about where the line is between public safety and people with disabilities. And that's, largely speaking to COVID itself being a disability. I think, it's going to be interesting to see as we learn more about COVID and what the long-term effects are. And, as the way it gets transmitted, the information seems to be changing on a daily basis. And I think helping even the most well-meaning housing providers, employers, and places of public accommodation comply with both the public safety components and the protections for people with disabilities is something I think we're trying to think through as more information comes out. And I included some information that we've put up on our website that we're changing as more information comes out, but about best practices for places of public accommodation, as well as employers and housing providers on dealing specifically with COVID as a disability, and making sure you're both complying with whatever public safety guidelines are being put out, but also making sure that you're not, trampling on anyone's civil rights in the process.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Megan Parker. So Megan, you've been a longtime advocate as well for people with disabilities. Could you tell us a little bit about what led you to your career's work on behalf of persons with disabilities?
Sure, thank you. And first, I want to thank you for having me be part of this panel. It's really an honor to be, on the same panel as people like Jim Weissman, who had such a key part in the creation of the ADA, and Susan Dua, whose center has been a party to so many landmark cases, and who I have the privilege of working with on a regular basis. So I'm happy to be here. I am myself a person with a disability. I'm blind, and so I think, I really had a firsthand experience of losing my vision in my early 20s, and realizing there's a real difference in the way people treat you. Even though when I was visually impaired for a long time, people, although I had a disability, could not tell. But once it became obvious, it became very clear that there's a very stark difference between the way people are treated when they know you have a disability and when they do not think you do. And so I knew coming out of college and starting my career that I really wanted to advocate for marginalized people. That was really important to me, people having access to basic services like housing was something I was incredibly passionate about. And so when I first saw a posting at the Independent Living Center in Yonkers, I didn't even know what that was. But it was immediately just the right fit for me. It was a true eye-opening experience when, if you will, coming into an organization full of people with all kinds of disabilities and also people without disabilities, all working together, a group of incredibly passionate advocates. My boss at the time, Mel Tansman, was really a mentor to me. He took me under his wing and actually worked for Jim for quite a while before leading the Independent Living Center in Yonkers. And so it was a great fit because Mel himself was also incredibly passionate about making sure people have access to affordable, accessible, and integrated housing, that they can get community-based long-term care services, and transportation, employment, and all the other areas that touch people with disabilities' lives. And so it was just a real community that, you know, honestly, before coming to the Independent Living Center, I wasn't really aware of that there was such a disability rights movement. I was aware of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it wasn't really on my radar. I was younger when it passed. I was in school, and it was, you know, I'm probably one of the early people who came up largely with a disability after the passage of the ADA. Kind of taking for granted certain accommodations being bestowed, being given to me, that I had rights, you know, that I was largely integrated and able to get accommodations. You know, but I think the disability rights movement really helped me grow as a person with a disability, as well as helping others, because you know, while independent living is just incredibly empowering for people with disabilities, and being in an environment like that where you're just working with so many people with so many different experiences, you realize there is a common thread that we all have, and we're always stronger when we fight together. And so I basically never left.
Good for you. Megan, I know also you've done quite a bit of work in bringing some of the provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act into the New York State human rights law, as well as the other panelists here with us today. Could you speak a little bit about that work and some of the accomplishments that have been realized by bringing some of those provisions into the state human rights law?
Yeah, so you know, I think we realized as a network across the state that it was really important that while we have these protections at the federal level, that we also get them embedded into state law. For a couple of reasons. One has to do with enforcement. You know, before we started this Q&A, John, you kind of went through the timeline if people are facing discrimination due to COVID, and it was 30 days or 60 days for different steps. But if anyone out there has tried to file a complaint with the Department of Justice at the federal level, you know that there is no such quick timelines. And so, you know, that's one issue. It's just more accessible, if you will, for people from an enforcement standpoint to file either in state court or through the Division of Human Rights, as opposed to trying to navigate the federal court system or the Department of Justice, which may or may not ever get to your complaint. And there's also, you know, there's always threats, and we heard from Jim, you know, that there, even at the beginning of the ADA, but throughout, you know, we've seen threats, people who want to strip away protections of the ADA, to weaken them. I think some of that's happened through courts, but even, you know, in the last couple of years, there was a real push in Congress to do something called notice and cure, which basically would put extra mandates on the person with the disability who cannot get into a place of public accommodation or who cannot access a website, to put the person, you know, put the business on notice that they need to fix it, which is ridiculous because this law has been in place, as we all know now, for 30 years. And so there's really no excuse. And it just would make it much harder for a person, you know, to get access if that law went into play. And thankfully, the disability community really came together and pushed back on that, and that did not happen. But it's important to have, I think, laws like parts of the Americans with Disabilities Act in state law so that we have that additional layer of protection, so that if things happen like Supreme Court decisions perhaps, or regressive laws that peel back some of our protections, we may still have those protections in state law. And so, you know, we do have the equivalent of Titles 2 and 3, which cover state and local governments, and public accommodations, so businesses and theaters and all kinds of that. Of course, you guys on the panel know, but, you know, for those at home. And I think, you know, that gives people an extra layer of protection so that they know that they have options in terms of enforcement, and they have extra protection in the case that bad decisions are made at the federal level.
Thanks very much, Megan. Jim, I wanted to follow up with you on something Megan brings up, and I've heard you speak about in the past. Megan mentioned she grew up with the ADA in place for most part, and I've heard you speak before about pre-ADA generation and a post-ADA generation. And I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on that with the group here today. You have to unmute yourself, Jim. You have to unmute yourself.
There we go.
There you go.
I'm sorry. It kept popping back up every time I turned it up. Megan really highlighted it with her experience. There are some things that the pre-ADA advocates know that the post-ADA advocates don't. Pre-ADA advocates, I think, felt like I did, that the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, now called Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, would be the great equalizer. Passed in 1975, kids are going to be mainstreamed. I mean, it's pie in the sky when you think about it now, what's happened. But I envisioned in the mid-70s, I was a new lawyer in 77. I envisioned, and it started enforcing IDEA. I envisioned that by 1990, or certainly by 2000, after 25 years of kids being mainstreamed, that they would be so accepted by their peers that it would be like glasses, disability would be like glasses or braces or fat and skinny. And the schoolyard, it would temper them because kids are merciless. They'll, just like if you wear glasses, they make fun of you, they make fun of your disability. It would have the same status as that. It would be minimized. You'd be class clown and class president and prom queen. You know, I really had this vision of integration and acceptance because I always just felt that exposure was the problem, or lack of exposure of people with disabilities. I think we learned quickly that that's not true. I think by 1990 it was clear that even though 30-something states had their version of a human rights law, that there was not a collective consciousness about needs and rights, either among disabled people or people without disabilities. And the ADA was not a finish line. It was a baseline. You know, we got there, and that
right.
Older generation of disability advocates felt a great sense of accomplishment, but nobody was kidding themselves by the time we got there. We realized that 25 years after, or 15 years after IDEA, the educating kids in most integrated setting appropriate to their needs, were still completely segregated with able-bodied people, mentally capable people, and disabled people. And it hadn't really made much of a difference. They didn't expect to compete for the same jobs and the people with disabilities. They expected that they would be home on benefits in 1990, even with their public school graduation. They didn't expect to be part of the labor force. It just wasn't accommodating. And that was what Congress realized, I think, in 1990. The left and the right can always agree that everybody who can work should. It's pretty hard to get people to argue with that point. And so what facilitates work? And it would be ADA. And I still think there's miles to go, I said before, on ADA, to enforcement and to equalize things. I do want to say one thing, though. I made myself a note. The Justice Department shall investigate, is what the statute says, complaints. It doesn't say when they feel like it. It doesn't say if they don't get enough of an appropriation, they don't have to do it. It doesn't say they should pick and choose which complaints they'll take and which they shouldn't. It says they shall investigate. They don't investigate most complaints. Most complaints, you get a letter that gives you the, thank you, but we're not going to take your complaint. So there's work to be done there. If the Justice Department are going to be the people's lawyers, they have to start enforcing ADA. Now, they do have ADA units. It's changed dramatically in the last 30 years. Southern District, Eastern District in New York have ADA units. I'm not sure about Northern, but I know they have ADA units in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they do have them in many of the U.S. Attorney's Office all over the U.S., and they do a lot of enforcement. But the amount of complaints is staggering compared to the number investigated and enforced.
Right. I'm going to ask this question for all the panelists, but Jim, since I have you on, I'll start with you. How do you see the landscape shifting right now, given the pandemic, for civil rights for people with disabilities?
Well, I think we're going to have a whole new bunch of advocates coming because of COVID. ADA protects you if you associate with people with disabilities too, like other civil rights statutes. So I think it's a good tool for going back to work. I'm healthy. My employer thinks that the essential functions of my job have to be done in the office. I'm going to go in. I'm not healthy and my employer thinks that, and I have a suppressed immune system. I'm going to start thinking about ways that I can use this ADA to get my essential functions moved to my home or to a safer environment, an isolated area. I mean, there's all kinds of accommodations. It doesn't just have to be work from home. I mean, in a meatpacking plant, obviously you're not working from home, but there could be protections that would afford people with disabilities the ability to work that without it, they'd be stuck on unemployment or Social Security disability. So, and I think that everybody with a suppressed immune system or who's the spouse of someone or mother of someone with a suppressed immune system is going to be thinking, I can't necessarily take public transportation every day to work and come home. Many of these people are, for lack of a better term, essential workers. We had people with disabilities rejecting home care workers who are essential to their lives because they're taking public transit to and from work. They'd rather double up, share attending care, move in with relatives temporarily, and isolate than risk the home care worker. Same thing was true of home care workers. They didn't want to go to work. They didn't want to bring COVID home to their families. Yeah. So, and that was in the immediate aftermath, where as soon as, New York City had its big crisis, that really started happening in a wholesale way. I think this is going to happen as people go back to work. I think teachers are going to be the catalyst. Schools are going to be forced to reopen by politicians in unsafe ways. And while students might even be safe, I've heard from asymptomatic people with MS in the last few days about having to go to work. And they're extremely concerned, independent of each other calling. We have a lot of MS members. Independent of each other, they're extremely concerned about having to go back to work. Yeah, so employers are going to learn how to deal with this, I guess. I'm an employer too. We have 48 employees, you know, and a lot of them have disabilities. We're trying to juggle all that.
Yeah.
These laws apply to us as employers too, so I really do feel the pinch. But people with disabilities have rights. They have to be acknowledged. You can't do what's best for the business if that's just your concern. You do have to do what's right by the business, of course, but you still have to make the accommodation.
Thanks, Jim. Susan, I'd ask you to weigh in on this part, this question here. With the shifting landscape for civil rights for people with disabilities given these challenging times. You'll have to unmute, yeah. There you go.
It is critical to plan and be prepared for disasters, whatever they may be. And New York was caught short and responded $1 short and a day late. And as a consequence, the pandemic really took hold. And the people it took hold of are people living in congregate settings who are people with disabilities. I mean, in New York City, 60% of people in homeless shelters are people with disabilities. The pandemic is right there. Nursing facilities, everybody's got a disability. The pandemic is wiping them of people, is just like scattering them as if with a big wave. And families are devastated. Workers, 25% of workers are sick. It is hitting in adult homes, in assisted living, group homes, across the board. And particularly now, workers with disabilities, with high-risk conditions, particularly those who work in high-risk environments, are at very, very, very high risk. People are being told they must go back to work, and yet there is no guidance coming from any quarter regarding what are the protections for someone who is at higher risk, but is supposed to be working in a very high risk setting. What is the guidance for them? I can't find it anywhere, and I think that's incredibly remiss. These are people with disabilities who've been made invisible despite the higher death rate in this pandemic. I think there are challenges about people with disabilities being left behind by testing and tracing programs if they can't get down to the street or climb into a van or go into some big facility where other people will be there. I'm concerned about also people with intellectual disabilities, people with cognitive disabilities. I have a brain injury. People who have mental health disabilities, people who have just communication-related disabilities, have been going into the hospital terrified because everything is happening so quickly in the emergency rooms and in the hospitals. It's just snap, snap, snap. Shortages of staff, shortages of everything. They're at higher risk, many, and they lack the communication tools, some, without being given extra time to communicate, without being given tools to use to communicate, without being given aides to work with to communicate, or family members. And, you know, this was a terrible problem that emerged early on that some approached by developing written guidance that you could fill in and bring with you so that it would be handed in when you went into the ER and handed to everyone who saw your record. Now, I wish it were true that in a busy ER, everyone is reading everything in someone's record, but I've experienced too many ER visits. And so that remains a big worry to me. I'm concerned about a lot of the communications that have not had ASL interpreters on the screen. I'm concerned about all of the written communications going out, but when you ask for large print or alternate formats, where the heck are they? For people with additional anxiety, yes, there are mental health helplines, but there's a tremendous need for those of us with anxiety and depression to have it acknowledged that we don't just need a single call and a bunch of phone numbers to call to places that are all full up. We need, we need a more planned and concerted effort for help for us.
Right.
Looking at this through a cross-disability lens, as I do every day, I have grave concerns about what's happening out there that we're going to see later. I'm worried about the people who are in facilities who've been neglected.
Yeah.
I'm worried that Congress wants to give nursing facilities a blanket, bold, multi-year bells on with all the Christmas ornaments on the tree, immunity from suits for negligence due to staffing shortages, due to lack of PPE, seeing hospital workers and nursing facility workers wearing plastic bags, complaining of having to wear or share PPE.
Those are all very scary items there. I agree.
Very alarming times where we're going to have to sift through what can we use our federal, state, and local laws to address.
Right.
And
thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you, Susan. Catherine, I just wanted to ask you briefly about how the City Human Rights Commission is reacting and operating during this time with the pandemic.
Sure. So we are we've established a COVID response team that's acting quickly to address COVID-related complaints that are coming in, both disability related, but also some of the associated race and national origin harassment claims that are related to COVID. And we've been turning those around relatively quickly, stepping in rather than filing a formal complaint, but trying to negotiate resolutions quickly, and then investigating larger complaints at a later date, but recognizing that, we are in a state of emergency and things that are related to COVID are having a far-reaching effect. But our office is open. We're accepting complaints. We're doing everything virtually through either phone calls or video calls, depending on what works best for the potential complainants. And we are moving things forward. We're setting up our first virtual trials, which are going to be very interesting for us to go through. But everything is still moving forward. I will also say, I think, I'm going to take the optimist approach to what's going to come out of this in several years down the line. I think there's going to be a lot of work for the people on this panel and the people attending this call. And I think we're going to be suing a lot of the people that Susan was talking about. But I also think, we are in a moment where there's the technology that allows for accommodations that weren't possible in the past. And that to me is really exciting, because I think by more people, becoming people with disabilities by virtue of having contracted COVID, there are going to be more people looking to have these conversations, and the conversation around reasonable accommodation will hopefully become something that's, much more normal in the workplace and not the exception. And so I don't usually take the optimistic point of view, but I'm going to take it now and say that coming out of all the lawsuits and coming out of all the advocacy, we're going to reach a moment where we can, change some of the conversation around when people need reasonable accommodations.
Thanks, Catherine. And Megan, lastly with you, what's the New York Association of Independent Living? What kind of resources are they bringing to bear for people with disabilities during this time?
Sure. So, of course, we're a membership association composed of independent living centers around the state. And so many of the critical direct services being provided are being done at the local level. Independent living centers can really vary community to community because they're based on the local needs. But, we are providing some statewide programs, but at the local level, so many centers have, through this crisis, have been reaching out, proactively making calls, making sure the needs of people are being met, all the varied needs. providing transportation and access to technology. Some of the centers have provided iPads to people in nursing facilities, have made sure that people can get food. There's just been so many different creative new ideas coming out of the centers across the state. They've been so flexible to really meet the needs of the people in their communities. At the statewide level, you know, we have a couple of programs that are particularly critical for helping people get out of nursing facilities. You know, and Susan was touched on how devastating this pandemic has been for people living in congregate settings, nursing facilities, adult homes, group homes. It's just been devastating. I mean, we've all read the papers. The percentage of people dying in those facilities is appalling. And a couple of our programs really help facilitate people leaving institutions, which is the safest thing for people at any time, but especially during a pandemic. So we have Open Doors, which is our Money Follows the Person program, which has, through the independent living centers around the state, people go into nursing facilities and meet with people and really help facilitate them transitioning back to the community, making sure that all the services are in place. And it just gets very complicated to leave, and most people don't without that kind of assistance. And to complement that, we have 2 rental subsidy programs, the Olmsted Housing Subsidy, as well as our Rapid Transition Program, both of which help people by providing a subsidy so that housing is more affordable if you are on a fixed income, but also provides those supportive services, because if you're living in a nursing facility, you can't get out to go look at apartments. I mean, that's very difficult. So and even if you're not in a facility, finding accessible and affordable housing is so hard in this state. It's really a crime. So, if you will. So, you know, we have a team of people around the state who go out and help find that housing and help secure housing and get all the essentials people need in place to safely transition into appropriate housing. And so I hope that, you know, some of those programs unfortunately had to be put on pause at first, but, you know, we're moving again, and, you know, people, those services are available around the state to help people get out of facilities, and we're always really proud of the work that we're able to do around the state through the centers under those programs.
Thanks very much, Megan. We have about 10 minutes left of the program. I wanted to move to some of the questions that we have from the audience. 2 of them I can speak to. One of the questions is what is considered a disability under the state human rights law? So while we're celebrating ADA today, there are a number of protections mirrored in the state human rights law of the ADA for people with disabilities. And the definition of disability under the state human rights law is a generous one. It covers physical, medical, or mental impairments. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a requirement that the limitation be substantial and affect a major life activity. So that gets scrutinized a bit more at the federal level, whether or not you're disabled enough to get protections. But under both the state and the city human rights law, the coverage of individuals with disabilities is broader and quite a bit more generous. The other question that I can answer before turning over some of the questions to our panelists is whether or not the state human rights law, if there's any thoughts to changing the human rights law with regard to financial responsibility of reasonable accommodations in apartments on landlords. What I can share with you is, as it exists, the human rights law is distinguished from the Federal Fair Housing Act in that it does require landlords and housing providers to pay for modifications to common areas. So if it's making entrance to the apartment building, an area that's commonly used by people that live there, and an accommodation needs to be made or a modification needs to be made in order to allow a person with a disability to use that space, landlords can be obligated to pay for those modifications. A couple of the other questions that come through, 2 in particular I wanted to share. Susan, I thought maybe I'd start with you. and you touched upon this a little bit in your remarks, but just the challenges that exist for people with invisible disabilities, cognitive impairments, intellectual impairments. How do you see those being met, and how do you see those, what are the opportunities to advance awareness around those issues?
We have a long way to go in helping the public, helping policymakers understand invisible disabilities, not view people with mental health disabilities as dangerous, as the perpetrators of violence rather than the victims of it. We have a long way to go before the Child Victims Act in New York State has a counterpart in the Adult Victims of Sexual Abuse Act. We have a lot to do in terms of the ability of people with intellectual disabilities to take control of their own lives, to make decisions with supports that they need in place, to call upon as they need them. Independent housing is something that's very, very hard to get if you have an intellectual disability or a mental health disability. And for people particularly with traumatic brain injury and mental health disabilities, we get a lot of calls about their housing being under threat. They have some of the worst stories that I've ever heard are about tenant and landlord and personnel harassment of tenants with mental health disabilities. We have a long way to go in making some headway with the real estate sector and with landlords and building accessible housing for very low income people with disabilities. In New York City, 36% of us are living under the federal poverty level. 58% are living under 200% of the federal poverty. That's near poor, although I think it's poor. And there's just no housing, and no housing that's accessible. And this is at a crisis level. I'm thinking about the evictions we're going to see post-COVID. When the moratorium on evictions ends, and the landlords who've already pre-filed rush into court to evict people, how many people with disabilities are going to be pushed out into the shelter system? People with intellectual disabilities that maybe have some behaviors that the landlord or the super are uncomfortable with, or people with mental health disabilities who need to be worked with in a reasonable way that respects their disabilities, shoved out. And I'm terribly worried about that next thing that's going to happen. But we're here as a community to unite, to advocate, to engage in demonstrations, civil disobedience, community surveys, education of public and policymakers, and litigation, if need be, around all of these issues. And my urge now is a call for everyone to come out, to get in touch with New York's Association on Independent Living at their website and say, I want to know about the advocacy opportunities in my area, and get connected to an independent living center with a robust advocacy team of citizen advocates in order to move forward.
Susan, you segue terrifically into what I'd like to have the last question for all the panelists that was just posted by one of our attendees. You know, many of us here have some of the 30 years or all of the 30 years to celebrate the ADA. The question, and Susan, it touches upon your last remark, is how can individuals volunteer? How can they get involved in the movement? And how can they advance civil rights for people with disabilities? So, Jim, you have some perspective on that to start?
Well, I wish I knew what it is in people with disabilities that make some participate in advocacy and some not, because I would use it and make everyone participate in advocacy. You know, where so many things, you know, you're black or you're white and you're a Jew or you're not, and you're a northerner or a southerner, and we identify with all of it, but we don't act on most of it. We want people with disabilities to be assimilated, but at the same time as we want that desperately, we want them to distinguish themselves as advocates for people with disabilities and come out, as people with disabilities. So it's almost like a conflicting goals, but there needs to be, and I think there is, and the 30th anniversary is demonstrating it, a new generation of leadership of people with disabilities. We have to foster leadership in the disability community. We have to make people, yes, we want them on Wall Street and we want them to be romantic leads, and we want complete assimilation. But at the same time as that we want young people with disabilities to be leading the disability rights movement. And United Spinal works really hard to develop young leaders around the country for that reason. And I know that, American Association of People with Disabilities acknowledges young leaders and develops young leaders. And lots of community groups are doing that with people with disabilities. So if you get involved in advocacy, you have a goal, you're driven, you have friends, you have purpose, you start leading a purposeful life, you feel empowered. Wheelchair sports does it for some people too, and the other thing is volunteering for candidates changes the world for people with disabilities. First of all, they get to know an elected official if the guy wins. They've got a relationship. They might even get a full-time job out of the relationship for campaigning. But you turn on elected officials to disability rights issues when you do that. So it's not just volunteering with disability groups and disability advocacy. It's getting out there and pushing everyone to change, not just people with disabilities working for themselves, but working for change in that community where they reside. And it's happening, and these ADA things, celebrations, promoted. It's kind of lost a little bit in Black Lives Matter at this time of year, but it's the same kind of issue. Millennia of ignorance and ignoring people with disabilities and ignorance are what people with disabilities are confronting. 400 years of repression is what Black people are confronting. But of course, it's driven by hatred and animus. But people with disabilities who are discriminated against for millennia just because of low expectations. But the result's the same. So what I mean is unemployment, poverty, stigma. So there's a lot of commonality in it, and I think developing young leaders is our answer.
Thanks, Jim. That's great. Megan, what do you have to add to the discussion here on people interested in joining the movement, joining the cause, promoting it, moving it forward?
There's so many ways to plug in, as Jim and Susan were talking about. Certainly through your local independent living center. They are advocacy organizations at their heart. They don't just provide services. They really are run by and for people with disabilities and fight for the rights of people with disabilities in their community and statewide. And so I encourage people to plug into their local independent living centers. There's a really active community of advocates on social media, especially for younger people. And in this day where we're all connecting virtually, that's perhaps another great way to connect. Leading up to the election, there's a popular hashtag, CryptoVote, that you can follow and participate with. Jim mentioned Black Lives Matter. Well, there's, a Black Disabled Lives Matter movement really building, and that's another popular hashtag. And so that's a way for younger people who are maybe more active on social media to be involved. I do think that the pandemic has allowed a lot more people with disabilities to be involved in events like this. If this event was held a year ago, we would have all been in person somewhere, and you would have had to travel to come participate. But now we have so many people who are able to just plug in, making it so much more accessible to so many people with disabilities. And so, I hope we are reaching a lot of people who maybe couldn't have come out to events, that will reach out. You know, the independent living centers are having so many different virtual events and getting really creative, and there's just so many ways to participate. And, you know, I also sit on the boards of a couple of grassroots organizations for blind people. So, you know, the cross disability movement, I think, is particularly special, but, you know, there are so many groups out there advocating for our own niche issues as well. And I think we're easily findable online. So.
Thanks, Megan. We're out of time, folks. I'm sorry. It's been a great program. I wish we had more time to go through these issues, very important issues. But I really, really want to thank our presenters, Jim, Susan, Megan, and Catherine, for participating, for sharing their experiences and the resources that they bring to the community of people with disabilities. Lastly, for all the program attendees, you can expect to receive an email with a link to a brand new Disability Rights Handbook that's being published by the New York State Division of Human Rights. So we're happy to share that information with you. And also consider me, consider the division, consider these panelists ongoing resources for you. We've published their contact information and links to their agencies in the chat box. My contact information is available on the New York State Division of Human Rights website. You can feel free to reach out to me with any questions or issues you'd like to continue to raise in this conversation. So at this point, I'm going to close the program. Again, I want to thank our presenters. I want to thank the staff at the New York State Division of Human Rights, thank our commissioner, and all of you, the attendees of this program, for participating with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.